Hi guys, thanks for joining this tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at functions in Solidity. We're going to learn about the four function visibility parameters, the difference between read and write functions. We also check out view and pure functions, take a look at how to define return parameters for functions. And finally we learn how to send ETH to a function. Okay, let's get started. We start with a very basic contract, so we have our license identifier, the Solidity version, and a basic contract called functions with a public state variable. So whenever you create a public state variable, the Solidity compiler automatically creates a getter function for you. If you leave out the public keyword, the state variable will be internal by default and no getter function will be created. Okay, so now we create our first function. Use the function keyword. The name of the function, for example, let's call it change value. And we provide input parameter. Let's call it underscore value. And the only thing we need to specify is the visibility modifier. So let's get started with a public function. Okay, now we set the value. Value equals our underscore value. Okay, that's it for a function. So that's the most basic function. Public is the most accessible of the four visibility modifiers. And public means that this function can be called from within our contract. It can be called externally from another smart contract or from a Web3 application. And it can also be called from another contract that inherits from our functions contract. So for example, calling a function internally means we add some test function. Let's call it call change value. Internally calling means here from this function, which is defined within our contract, the change value function can be called. Okay, so this function can also be called from another contract that inherits from our functions contract. So for example, if you define another contract, let's call it inherit functions, that with the is keyword inherits from our functions contract. Then from a function defined within this inherited contract, we can call our change value. Okay, let's deploy our contract. Make sure to select the Remix VM, click the deploy button, and now we get three functions. We get a getter function for the public value. We get this function, the change value, because it's public, and we also get this one. So let's take a look. Okay, so the value by default will be 0. We can use our change value to modify the value. Let's put it to 5. Okay, it's fine. Now we check again value, and it's 5. Okay, so that's working. Now let's take a look. If you make our function external, it can be only called externally. So this will no longer work, because this would be an internal function call. So let's comment this function. Let's just comment this one here. Also, we can't call it from a contract that inherits from our functions contract. So this won't work neither. But if we delete the function, redeploy it, we still get the change value because it's possible to call the function externally, and of course we get the getter function. Okay, so we have our two functions. So the next visibility modifier is internal. As the name suggests, so if we make a function internal, it can be called internally. So this will work again. We uncomment it, and now it's fine. And this will work as well. So an internal function can be called from within the contract and from another contract that inherits from our contract. Okay, and if we deploy our contract, we won't get the change value, but we will get the call change value because that's public. So let's redeploy, and we no longer have our change value function. So only the call change value, the second because it's public. Okay, the final modifier is private. This is the least accessible, means the function can only be called from within our contract. So this is still fine. this will no longer work. So let's get rid of this function. And we won't get the function if we recompile it. So now we get only our call change value and we get our public getter. All right. Okay, let's take a quick look at read and write functions in Solidity. Read functions are not allowed to modify any state. Well, actually, they're not allowed to modify any data on the blockchain. For a read function, a simple function call is performed. The result is returned immediately, and a read function doesn't cost anything. A write function, on the other hand, modifies the state of the blockchain. In order to execute a write function, a transaction is required. The transaction needs to be signed with a private key. And the state of the blockchain will be changed only once the transaction has been included in a new block. This can take somewhere from 15 seconds to several hours. And this depends on how much of a gas fee you're willing to pay. And yes, of course, for each transaction, a gas fee needs to be paid. Now we take a look at view and pure functions. View functions can only read from state, but they are not allowed to modify the state. So what does it mean to modify state? Well, the state is modified whenever you modify a state variable, but also when you emit an event, because whenever you emit an event, some data is added to the log associated to a smart contract. Also, when you create another smart contract from your smart contract, because the bytecode will be added to the blockchain and the state of the blockchain will change. Another event that modifies state is using the self-destruct function that destroys a smart contract. Also, when you send Ether, because Ether will be sent from one account to another, so the public ledger changes. And of course, also when you call another function that modifies state. Okay, let's take a look at pure functions. So the same restrictions that we just saw for view functions also apply for pure functions. But on top of that, pure functions are not allowed to read any state. And reading state means that we can't access any state variables, but also we are not allowed to, for example, call the balance member of the address type. And furthermore, we're also not allowed to call any of the members of the block and message global variables. So for example, we are not allowed to use message value or message sender, and we are not allowed to use member functions like block number or block hash. Okay, let's add some view and pure functions to our smart contract. I think we no longer need this function. That's fine. Okay, let's start with the view function. Well, as we know, a view function can read from state, but we are not allowed to modify state. For example, you're not allowed to modify the value of this variable. In order to define a view function, we add the keyword view to our function declaration. And our view function typically will also return something. So we do this with the returns keyword. And in this case, we're returning an unsigned integer. Okay, so that's a very basic view function. Now let's add a pure function. As we know, a pure function is similar to a view function, but we are not allowed to read any state variables. So we couldn't do something like this, where we read the state variable with. Okay, so let's say we define a simple function that performs two operations, addition and multiplication, provide two values, and we return two values of our calculations. For a pure function, instead of using the view keyword, we use the pure keyword. Okay, similar, we return our values. Here we say just return variable add and the second variable. So that's a very basic pure function. Once again, we are neither allowed to modify state, so we can't say something like value equals some other value. We're also not allowed to read any state variables, so we couldn't use anywhere the value here. And just in terms of return parameters, you can also assign a name for your return parameter. For example, to make the code a bit more readable, we say, okay, that's the result of our addition, that's the result of our multiplication. And then we could say something like, okay, we get rid of this here, we just assign our two variables. We say add equals what we just did, multiply equals this one here. Then we don't even need the return parameters. We just assign those two variables, and that's basically the same. Okay, so there are two different ways to return values. You either provide only the type and you use the return statement, or you provide type and a name for a type, and you just assign the type without the need to use the return keyword. Okay, let's also take a quick look how we would call this function and how we would assign those two return parameters to a new function. Okay, just add another function, call add and multiply. The function calls this one, add and multiply, provides the two values. Okay, we know this function returns two unsigned integers, so we simply define two unsigned integers in brackets and return from here. Okay, and finally let's take a quick look how we can send ETH to a function. Okay, we define an event. In the event we log the address of the sender, the amount that was sent to us, and we emit the event within our function send ETH. However, this won't work, because in order for a function to be able to receive ETH, we need to add the payable keyword. So now this will work. Let's give it a quick try. We delete our old contract. We redeploy, and now we have a payable function, which will be read here. Okay, so let's say we just send 1000 way. Okay, that passes. You can also look at the log. Okay, here's the information. The sender was our contract, which ends with C4. Sorry, the address here. And the amount we sent was 1000 way. Okay, so that's it pretty much for functions in Solidity. To sum it up, we have 4 visibility modifiers: public, external, internal, and private, where public is the most accessible. Then we have read and write functions. A read function is not allowed to modify state, whereas write functions modify state and they require transaction and also require some gas cost. Then we have 2 different types of read functions. We have view functions, which use the view keyword, and pure functions. Pure functions are not allowed to read any state variables. And finally, in order to allow for a function to receive ETH, we need to use the payable keyword on the function. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.